Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Cluster API vSphere Provider bi-weekly syncup. Today is October 22, 2018. I posted a link to the meeting notes in the chat. If anybody wants to add some additional agenda items, please go ahead and do it right now. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and start with the first item. As of last time we talked, we were still working on the Govimami actuator, and during the last 2 weeks, we discovered that the cluster control did not work with the Govimami actuator. In the last 2 weeks, we have fixed this problem, and so cluster control, CTL, will now work at creating a cluster using the Govimami actuator, and the Govimami actuator is actually now the default actuator. We know that the delete path currently is broken. We debated on whether we should fix the delete path now, or whether we should also go ahead and do the migration for the CRD migration. So the current code base that is in the repo is based on the old API server aggregation. And since the main repo has already moved on to CRD, and the GCP and AWS provider has already moved on to CRD, we decided to go ahead and do the CRD migration first and then fix the delete path for cluster CTL afterwards. So, okay, that's the first item. Are any questions on that item?
I agree. Yes, I think this is a good direction, because I think once we migrate to the CRD, we have a cleaner API interface. At least when I look at the GCP migration to the CRD, it's not a small change on the API. So
I'm just discovering that. I'll speak to that at the last item. Okay.
Just a question. What do you mean by the cluster CTL link path? Which part is broken? I asked because okay. I've been able to build the code and run with it.
So if you create a cluster, and you try to use cluster CTL delete cluster, it doesn't currently work. At least for me, it doesn't work. But create cluster works fine. But did delete work for you?
I'm not sure which link if you just run cluster CTL.
Yeah.
There are, and you ask it to create a Minikube cluster. There's a lot of pain. I think it doesn't work with version 110, and it also doesn't work with version 112.
110 and 112 of what?
So by default, you need to use an earlier version of Minikube, v28, I think, which restricts you to running Kubernetes 110, which then doesn't have, I guess, the you run into problems with updating the status field.
Okay.
Whereas if you run with Kubernetes 112, 111 or higher, then those other things work, but you can't. But now you've got the problem with Minikube. So if you skip Minikube and provide it with a kubectl config that points to an existing cluster, things can work.
Okay.
But never mind. That has nothing to do with the path of work going forward.
So did I capture this on the meeting notes? I wrote down that you said that cluster CTL didn't seem to work with Minikube 110 and 112. Is that?
Sorry. It doesn't work with Minikube higher than version 0.28. That's a known problem.
Okay.
And I think it also doesn't work with Kubernetes version 110.
Okay. I think currently on my system is using 1.9, and I was actually thinking about upgrading to 1.10, but I'm glad that you mentioned this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been testing on, I think it all comes down to the fact that we're using Minikube with the VMware driver, which is not merged in the main line, and we're relying on an old patch that hasn't been merged and has been stale for a few months, which is, I think, still at the time when 1.9.3 was current or something like that. I've been testing on the same environment too.
Fabio, do you have any update on when that gets merged?
That's a very good question. The problem here is that Minikube maintainers don't want to merge the patch because it's not under CI. And to have CI, we have to have a CI lists something to test one version of the driver. So the driver supports both Workstation on Windows and Linux and Fusion on Mac. So it supports 3 different platforms. We should have at least one tested in CI, and we have none at the moment. It was part of the original CI/CD effort, but it was deprioritized in favor of other things. And I mean, the PR is there, and it probably requires a rebase for sure, maybe some updates, because things have moved on since we opened that PR. It shouldn't take too long to do it, but we still have to fix the CI problem, which we don't have yet.
Is anybody working on trying to get that driver merged into their CI?
Not that I know of.
Who would normally do that?
Well, this was an effort that was supposed to be entirely sponsored by VMware. Initially, we thought we'd have Minikube rolled into the CI efforts for Kubernetes Core. But that didn't happen because of Kubernetes Core required a lot of more work than we previously imagined.
Okay.
I'm not sure if it's also a priority right now, given the many problems we have with Minikube. I mean, we could potentially just update the PR and make sure that it's current with the current code base, and people can try it out again against a more recent version of Minikube. I know that the team that is responsible for Fusion at VMware is kind of looking into picking up some of the work in the open source tooling, so Minikube, the Docker machine, and so on. But I'm not sure on the status of that.
Okay, are you in contact with them?
Yeah, I know the PM that is
okay.
kind of looking into these this thing. Maybe it would be worthwhile to copy him on the thread of the original PR Minikube.
Okay. Would you mind pushing them to see if they can help resolve this CI issue?
Mm-hmm. I'll do that.
Okay. So the next topic I wanted to talk about is if you guys have pulled the top of tree, you guys may have noticed that the photo structure has changed quite a bit. We did this so that we can try to match up the photo structure that the main repo and all the other providers, or the GCP provider, is following. And this is also the structure that is more in line with the Go project standard. And it also should help us as we move to do the CRD migration. Yeah, so just to let you know, if you guys update your project, you should see the folder structure change quite a bit. Okay, the next one, I put my name down, but it's actually Fabio. I wasn't sure if Fabio was going to be on here, but we have some progress on getting the cluster API, creating clusters on ESX. Fabio, do you want to speak a little bit on that topic?
Yeah, I've been working on a pull request for about 3-4 days now. I'm hitting some hurdles on the creation of a new VM. So the basic idea here is that currently we're relying on cloning a template on vCenter. So we have a vCenter environment that has multiple ESX hosts attached and has a VM that serves as a template. So we use the clone functionality of the API to clone that VM in multiple VMs that will become the cluster nodes. If we want to target a standalone ESX, so an ESX that is not managed by vCenter, unfortunately, we don't have access to the clone facility because cloning is not supported directly on ESX. So what we're doing, I'm basically working on replicating the same functionality through fetching the spec of the VM, of the template VM, even though it's not a template, it's just a regular VM. So fetching the machine spec of that VM, replicating the disk that is attached to it through data store copy, basically, and then recreating a new clone of it, which will bring us to a point where, basically we're replacing the clone functionality and we have tapped into the same workflow as before, just, by branching out if we recognize we're connected to a standalone ESX or a vCenter, and we use the correct facility for the machine creation. Unfortunately, it's not straightforward because there's no way to read that spec and copy that over. Otherwise, it would be very easy. But I'm working on reading properties pretty much one by one and replicating the spec of the VM, of the source VM into a new VM. So hopefully I'm going to have a PR out, well, definitely by the end of the week.
Okay. So I just want to mention that we're doing this work just for the productivity of development. I'm not sure what the policy is on advertising that it works on ESX. I know when we worked on VIC, we provided instructions on how to deploy VIC on ESX and VC. But as I understand, VC is the company's focus, and we don't really push ESX for anything. So I don't know whether we should put this in a markdown explaining how to do this on ESX. What do you think, Fabio?
Well, this is, I mean, if you look at the, there's really, there's really no need to run a cluster of Kubernetes nodes on a single machine. So the use case is pretty narrow, which is, in my case, I was thinking about doing it because I run Vagrant, I run ESX on using Vagrant on my machine to do development. And, I don't want to run an entire cluster, a vSphere cluster on my machine. I just run a bare bone ESX that gives me, a decent API surface that can work against. And, the only the only thing that is missing here is the clone functionality. Everything else is just, basic vSphere calls. So having that functionality helps a lot, in not requiring a vSphere cluster to test against, and it increases productivity a lot. And also testing, I mean, if we have to run some lightweight testing that does not necessarily test the create functionality because it's a different code path, I mean, we can definitely test it against a single ESX, also for demo purposes.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking for the demo purposes, it would be very nice because we will show some demo at KubeCon, and not having to connect up to a VC remotely would be or having to just record the demo would be a nice thing to do.
Yeah. Also, having not to carry around like a vSphere cluster like we did in the past is much appreciated.
Yeah.
Xavier, it looks like you already figured out the code, but ES16 has this functionality or things working with Python code for a long time. So I worked on that before. So if we need some reference, I think there's a ready code there be referred, like clone without vCenter and snapshot and everything. Kind of.
I'll ping you on that. I think I have 1 or 2 questions to ask you about that. I'll ping you
sure.
off.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. The next topic that we can discuss, and this is a early preview. So Fabio and I worked on a possible OVA workflow discussion last week. Fabio, do you think it's too early to show this and talk about this, or should we wait?
I think we can talk about it. It's it's very early. It's just it's really just a draft. It's properly it's a whiteboard. Let me see if I can share this.
Okay.
Share.
I have it in front of me in case.
Can you guys see it? It's a bit wide, unfortunately.
We'll draw it up into a nicer picture, but for now, this is a whiteboard.
This is really just a brainstorming we did last week. So the idea is that in order to well, first of all, in order to not rely on Minikube to do the bootstrap, we're thinking about how to package a potential unit of deployment for Cluster API in order to deploy clusters on top of vSphere. And the idea is to deploy an OVA on top of vSphere, and this OVA will act as a management cluster or a bootstrap cluster. I don't know exactly what the right word for it is, but so the idea is that a prepackaged OVA.
Hey, Fabio, can you scroll it to the left? We see like the center.
Sure. Let me see if I can squeeze it a little bit. Because unfortunately it's very wide, so
yeah.
I'm not sure how it'll reflect on your screen.
I can actually see the. I can see the diagram at the moment, at least.
Okay.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I'm focusing on the diagram first, and we basically wrote like a sort of a workflow for it. But this is really just just to pinpoint a few things we wanted to remember about the process we were discussing. So ideally, we have an environment here, multiple ESX, vCenter. We have an admin here with his laptop that deploys an OVA, and the OVA is deployed. And once the OVA is deployed, a bootstrap cluster starts up, and a bootstrap cluster is deployed through kubeadm. So it's a one-node cluster that runs on top of this OVA that has been deployed. The user then downloads the admin kubeconfig, which is the kubeconfig that gives you access to the bootstrap cluster. It generates the YAML and the keys. So the configuration for the target deployment, so the vSphere credentials, the name of the template, blah, blah, blah. And then uses cluster_ctl to deploy the target cluster, which is number 5 here, all the blue nodes. And this gives us a way to have a single unit of distribution that we can, deploy in every vSphere environment. Potentially, there's many users of vSphere that are using a management cluster for things like vCenter, management operations. Everything that has a control plane usually is deployed in a management cluster, and then they have a what they call a resource cluster which is running workloads. So this OVA will be ideally deployed in the management cluster, and will point to the resource cluster to deploy Kubernetes nodes. So that's the general idea behind this. Not really anything complex. The idea is that potentially the user can take the kubeconfig and use it to deploy multiple clusters. But this part is not really fleshed out yet. It's just a couple of ideas.
You know what, Fabio? I don't remember if we discussed the where the cloud init, whether that's going to be part of the OVA or I guess the ISO for the cloud init image.
You mean for the initial deployment or for
the VM template?
For the VM template.
So yeah. We didn't discuss that, did we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is just the beginning. We're going to refine it as we go along. We haven't even begun working on it yet. Anybody have any questions or comments?
I have a question, and that might be more general, but Fabio, you are saying that the user would use clusterctl as soon as the OVA-backed Bootstrap cluster is available.
Yes.
Why? Why can't I just use the machine and cluster, the new machine and cluster APIs which are available in the Bootstrap cluster? As said, that's probably a more general question, but that's a thing I don't really understand.
Okay, I could answer that question. Are you asking why would you use clusterctl instead of kubectl?
Yes.
There isn't really any reason why. If you want to use, clusterctl, the clusterctl only does a few things. One, it creates the initial Bootstrap cluster and does a pivot when it creates a target cluster. But all that clusterctl does is basically shell out to kubectl and shell out to SSH. And other than that, clusterctl doesn't do very much. It just makes it a nice package to call instead of calling kubectl.
Okay, then I think I understand it correctly. If I repeat what you said, is that if I don't do the Bootstrap cluster and then the pivoting, I don't necessarily need the clusterctl.
You don't. There is something that's coming called a cluster bundle. It's going to be it's a way to package up all the YAML file that you need for creating the target cluster, and it's going to be bundled in some form. And that might be, so clusterctl should be able to understand that. Whereas if you use kubectl itself yourself, you have to know what order to call, what order of YAML files to apply with kubectl. But you don't need to use clusterctl at all. It's just more of a convenience.
Okay, thanks.
I think for us, using clusterctl here was more like to point out that this is meant to create clusters than it is really functionality wise, because we could potentially use just kubectl here. It's just that it was probably easier to remember what this was about.
Yeah.
In fact, so I know I've shared this with Log, but essentially, internally, pretty much the diagram for OVA and the different components that you actually laid out. For my internal product purposes, and the product that I'm working on, the way we consume clustered API today, I kind of have almost exactly what you kind of drew out there, and the way I'm interacting with it is using kubectl. Directly interacting with the objects and not using the clusterctl CLI, because again, for my purposes, I don't need to. that's why. But yeah, I mean, we can talk more about offline about, maybe if this, what I've done, we can be reused, or if there's anything that can be, get a head start in this.
Okay. Okay, any more comments or questions? Okay. So the next topic, I'm gonna put your name by this, Hui, because this is your topic. Why don't you go ahead and present this, and then we can talk about this. I think, go ahead, Hui.
Okay, thank you. So I want to bring up this issue here, or I want basically getting some feedback is, can we review whether, because whether the VMC use case I'm currently encountering is a common use case or is just a corner use case. Their use case is we have a VMC infrastructure and cluster API today as architectural design, expecting that the bootstrap cluster will have direct access to their target cluster. So bootstrap cluster going to SSH to their target cluster to for a few purpose, like extracting the kube config informations. So this, so when we are working on the VMC infrastructure, the VMC infrastructure is a VMware, it's a VMware on AWS infrastructure, and it's a lockdown environment. So we are expecting to access the VMC vCenter externally. We do not expect to access the individual VMs directly. So basically, the vCenter is sitting on the management network, and it's external facing, and the VM is sitting on the private network by default, and it's isolated with each other. So with this infrastructure, if you run cluster API with the Minikube and you run against VMC, you will have a little problem. Means your Minikube cannot access to the VM directly. Although we kind of talk about it a little bit already between Locke and Cedar and me. This may not be a common case, so I want to hear some feedback, like how should we getting some understanding how our users architect the network, and is this something we want to address?
Yeah, so internally we discussed this a little bit, and what we said is that, so by the way, this is for end-to-end tests that Hui is working on. And one idea, there is a way to get around SSH access, but as it is today, cluster API at least cluster CTO expect SSH access. So my comment was that trying to tackle both getting end-to-end tests up and running and creating an alternative way to access the VM would actually extend the timeline. And one thing that we could do is possibly just stand up another VC cluster instead of using VMC. Hui, I don't know what the
so for the in terms of the end-to-end test CI, I'm not worried too much about it because we definitely had workaround.
Okay.
For example, we can create the Bootstrap cluster inside VMC. It's like in Fabio's diagram, the OVA deployed to the same vCenter as the target cluster. So the most likely will be on the same network as the target cluster. So in that case, it has the direct access to the VMs.
Okay.
The question I bring up here is we should discuss about whether we can support other cases. Like if your OVA is deployed to a management network that don't have the network or direct access to your target cluster, are we going to support that? Or like the Minikube case, if your Minikube actually don't have access to the VM directly, can we support that? So yeah, we can have two basically. We have one track is for the CI end-to-end test CI. I'm going to work on that and going to apply the workaround we need. On the other track is we should discuss about whether we want to support all those cases.
And my thinking on this is that we do want to support other cases, but initially when we talk about this at KubeCon, users may have a VC cluster that they want to try on. They may not necessarily know very much about VMC, so I think that the ordering should be just to get the end-to-end testing up and running, and then we can work on other ways to get this working with VMC.
Yeah.
So if I may add, so I think the problem that you brought up is actually going to be a common one. So one example that comes to mind that we should probably look at and see. So especially with, for example, say for even for VMC or in general with vSphere environment that has some, let's say, NSX in it, for example. One of the thing is the concept of floating IP, for example, in OpenStack, which essentially is saying that when you deploy your instance or a VM that goes onto some sort of a private network that you have not accessible outside, but you assign a floating IP to that VM, and that IP now is what you use to access that instance from outside. Right, so it's a general concept, right? I mean, we have OpenStack on vSphere working with providing the same functionality, and it uses again NAT rules created on the NSX, for example, in that environment. But in general, taking a step back, I mean, I think whenever we have a firewall, let's say VC, let's just like, for example, the VMC case, there are two things that come to mind that we could potentially handle. One is either using a floating IP. In that case, every node that you create may get assigned an external IP that you can use to get in. And we have to figure out a way how we can pack that information inside our spec so that we can predefine that. Second option could be that we potentially can evaluate is the concept of the jump host, wherein alongside with our setup, we can, let's say, just have one host that gets deployed in an environment with a floating IP, so that in case, let's say, if you're running short of floating IPs and you don't want to assign too many outward-facing IPs, then you just deploy one dedicated, let's say, a VM or an instance, or you reuse one of those that you're already deploying as part of the cluster, assign it as a floating IP, and then use that as a bastion host to basically get in and out across your different set of VMs. So these two solutions are essentially, if you want to use SSH and we cannot get rid of SSH, then this will probably be the way. However, there is a third mechanism that we can also implement, which, at least specifically for the VMware case, at least I can think about, is we can completely eliminate the need of SSH. And for that, we'll probably have to then depend upon something like a VMware tools, which I think we in general anyways are dependent upon because we want CloudNet to work properly and things like that. So there's some bit of dependency on VMware tools anyways on the guest. So for the general idea is with VMware tools inside the guest OS, the guest can publish some information out onto the VMX file that essentially somebody who is interacting with vSphere APIs can actually read out. So we can kind of build up, if you will, like a back channel communication between the VM and maybe the cluster CTL, who is interacting with just the vSphere APIs, with the VC, in a transparent way that doesn't require SSH at all. But again, this is, again, I'm just throwing out as a potential workflow and potential things that we can look at. That would, I'm sure theoretically they will work, but we'll have to figure out what limitations and some of those nuances. But yeah, just to bring these options at least that we can all think about more and see where we want to go in a little bit future time frame.
So there is also the option of using the custom CloudNet image that you're creating using Andrew's repo. Can we use something similar to that to pass information in and out?
Well, so I'm actually when I meant CloudNet, I mean essentially I'm already assuming that we are using that Andrew's CloudNet to begin with. I mean, so the point is that what Andrew's CloudNet does is helps us pass information from let's say the control cluster API controllers via the vSphere APIs into the guest instance that gets booted up. Right? That's how we kind of, the flow of information is from the controller to the VM. And now what I'm talking about is, what I'm suggesting is we can utilize the same VMware tools, and we can actually also say initiate an information pass on initiated from the guest to the VMX, which we can eventually read from the from our API controller. So basically the second directional information, like so that now we can have a bidirectional information, and that could be at least used for passing some metadata. I'm definitely not suggesting that to pass on something like logs. So no, that's not what it is for, but essentially mainly for metadata information exchange, so to speak, so that we can bring in the functionality.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Siddharth, could you, I was typing while you were talking at the first part of that. Can you up here, can you just type in, summarize everything that you said?
Okay, sure. I'll add that, not a problem.
Okay. So also, can you mute your mic, because there's a lot of background noise. Any other comments or question related to this topic? Okay.
Look, can I add a comment here if nobody is comment here? So yeah, I want to thank Siddharth to share a few actually potential solution here. I have been thinking about this for some time, and yeah, I think definitely there are a number of options there to address this. But before that, I also want to get some feedback, like even from in this call we may have potential actually users. So is whether this use case is actually common for on-premises data center or cloud. Because if it is, there's some commonality here. I think it's worth us to actually discuss in the upstream cluster API community, and potentially can propose some change. Or basically this, or if it's just unique to ours, like VMC, and then we definitely can work on some workaround or some solution only specific to VMC or vSphere. But the first question, I don't have the answer now.
Yeah, in my opinion, most of the other providers are building it out for public clouds. The guys who are building cluster API providers for the SSH provider and also the bare metal providers, they may have some similar problem. I don't know, but we can bring it up. We can definitely bring this up in the main cluster API meeting. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other comments or questions, we can move on to the next one. Okay. So the last topic is that we are currently, we have started the CRD migration. So as some of you guys know, that the current repo is based on API aggregation, and it's also using the older API code gen project that's actually not part of Kubernetes. So apparently, well, we wanted to move the main repo and all the providers to CRD now that we have enough critical mass in the number of people working on providers to do this before, to do this now instead of later. Also, the API code gen apparently has some subtle bugs. According to the guy who wrote it, he was on the meeting. The guy from Google was on the meeting a couple of weeks ago, and he said that there are subtle bugs that that we'll eventually run across, and we won't be able to figure it out because they're really very deep. And so the migration to CRD should fix all of these issues for us. So right now we're migrating our repo to CRD. The GCP and the AWS provider have already moved to CRD. Well, let me just rephrase that. The GCP provider has moved to CRD. I think the AWS provider began as a kube builder project. So the CRD was there from the beginning. So that's
So the OpenStack provider also has already moved to the CRD. I think they did like maybe about 10 days back, I think.
Okay. I was hoping that Marco was on this meeting because I think they wrote the DigitalOcean provider, and it would have been great to hear if they made the migration to CRD. Okay, so the last topic Siddharth wanted to put on here is that he wanted people to take a quick look at PR number 71. So after this meeting, I'll look over it.
Yeah, I mean, I can maybe just quickly summarize, like it's just a short version of what I'm trying to do, and then of course I'll love to have everybody just go and just at least comment out on it. So the basic idea there is today when we create the machine instances, we have literally a key value pair, a map of properties which define how the VM will look like. And what I want to do with this PR is move that from a simple map to a little bit more structured data, so that we can define the VM in a much more concise way. One benefit of doing that is, for example, if you want to do multiple NICs on that machine, without having a structured data, it's a little complicated and messy if you were to work around with a map. Similarly, the same case is applicable if you have multiple disks at the same time. So, and the other thing is for the network, for the NICs, I also wanted to introduce at least a placeholder where we could support static IPs in the vSphere environment. So if you don't have DHCP, then, and you want to specify a static IP for your machine in the spec itself, then there has to be some, a proper structured way of defining that. So my attempt is in this PR is just about that. I also have a follow-up PR on which actually builds on top of this PR, which actually introduces the creation of these instances using this structure, and also provides code to add static IPs to the instances. And this is the second PR is the one wherein it actually uses the Andrews CloudNet data source to be present on that base image. And that's where I had like an open question on that other PR is like, how do we want to deal with these custom images? Because now we have, if we want to go down the path of, let's say, supporting static IPs, which I think is very common with vSphere environments, I would say, at least, we would need to have the base image, regardless of what operating system, whether it is a Ubuntu or CentOS or any of those. Since CloudNet is a common tool, and the way Andrew's CloudNet data source has been written, it can work with pretty much most of the generic Linux distributions. That means we just need a base image that has Andrew's CloudNet data source in it. And unfortunately, that is not the standard Ubuntu cloud image or any other distro cloud image that we can use. So the open question is like, how do we, make sure that we have base image that has that Andrew's CloudNet in it? And I don't know if I have the perfect answer for that at the moment.
Fabio, do you have any idea on where we can keep these custom images? Don't we have a Artifactory account, a VMware Artifactory account that we can store this kind of stuff on?
You used to have bin tray, but I don't know if that thing still exists anymore. We used to use it extensively, but I remember there were some problems, but I didn't follow the story of it. I think Photon OS is still using it. But
what about our corporate Artifactory? Isn't Artifactory meant to be able to manage like multiple types of objects and files?
Well, yeah, bin tray is basically Artifactory as a service.
Okay, yeah. So is the VMware Artifactory account an external, or is it only internal only?
Well, I know VMware has an internal Artifactory, but it's obviously internal only.
Okay.
The external one was bin tray, which is, again, Artifactory as a service, pretty much. VMware has an account, and Photon OS is using it to distribute artifacts like RPMs and everything. But I don't have any other information.
So
maybe we should bring this up at the main
SIG VMware?
No, because we brought this up 2 weeks ago at SIG VMware. But maybe we should also bring this up at the main cluster API meeting to see what other people think.
Makes sense. Yeah, it's an ongoing debate. I mean, pretty much every SIG right now. SIG cloud provider has the same problem. There's no clear answer for this problem yet. So.
So I have actually maybe more fundamental question. So from the distribution perspective, I mean, for all these, let's say Ubuntu or Red Hat, or Red Hat probably might be a wrong example, but let's say CentOS or any distribution that you can just download and run. I mean, are we even allowed to, for example, customize that and then? I mean, this kind of like distribution. I'm not sure if that's if there's any hindrance into doing that. I mean, I was thinking maybe what if we could, let's say, create some sort of a script that any customer, for example, could download and literally run that script, and it would use some maybe one of the VMware product, or it could use like a VMware VC itself, or it could use something like a Packer or something, which could just generate a OVA on the fly for the user based on the specification that we lay out, and then they're free to just use that. I don't know. I mean, that will essentially get us off the hook of like creating these images, but on the same side, it has pros and cons. The cons would be then we don't know if they really created the image the right way, but
I think it's fine if we provide instructions or scripts or a prepackaged solution that people can run. I mean, I'm a big fan of having Packer templates to build, appliances. I mean, I've been using them for a long time, even for building Vic initially. So I like that approach, but I also like the fact that we should have a way to just provide something that people can use right away instead of just having to build it, pretty much from the bits, right? So something they can download like an OVA that is prepackaged. It runs Ubuntu, runs Photon OS, I don't care. Something that people can just download and use right away instead of downloading the bits, running a script that will prepackage the OVA and then install the OVA.
So I don't know about the Ubuntu, but CoreOS do have their the OVA templates for vSphere published, and it's not from ours, but they do publish the OVA that support container Linux config that works for vSphere. So maybe we have the option to work with different OS company to publish that, because Kata init looks like it's a standard way to config.
I'm sorry, Hui, I didn't hear what you were saying because I was typing.
Oh, I'm saying maybe we can work with a different OS company to publish their.
Yeah, we
OVA.
could. It's just that's a cycle that would take time, and I think some distro are already doing that. I think Siddhartha, I think you said that one distro was already using Andrew's data source.
No, I don't think there's any distro. I was saying basically that the distro images that I used today, they probably do not have his. I mean, so in a perfect world, what would happen is we can try and merge Andrew's Cloud Init data source into the core Cloud Init package itself. And once that happens, then eventually it will make its way into all the default distros. But that process is going to take some time.
Yeah, the cycle will definitely take.
Yeah, so we need in between till that happens. We need a solution in between to kind of help our customers and everybody who wants to try.
Okay. We're kind of running out of time, so I want to cut this topic short. We can discuss it more at SIG VMware. But the last one I do want to bring up is, speaking of where to save artifacts, where can we save the container for the vSphere machine controller? Right now, the old code that Google wrote saved the container on GCR. I think, Fabio, you said that we could save in the same place that the VMware cloud provider is saved.
Yeah, for cloud provider, we have we created a Google Cloud project, and so we're using GCR because in some testing, well, not real testing, just it's just experience, I would say. Working on various projects, we realized that Docker Hub is not necessarily the most available website out there, and GCR has proved to be, slightly better than it. So we decided to go with GCR. So we have a GCR project, Google Cloud project that we're using GCR for, and we can definitely store a cluster API for the time being, and maybe get another one. I mean, the cost associated with it is trivial, so it's not going to be a problem.
So maybe I can ask you offline where that is, so that when I update the project with the CRD, I can also update the location at that time.
Sure.
Okay. We're 3 minutes away from this meeting ending. I think we should end it here. We can, if anybody else has any more topics, we can bring it up in the next meeting in about 2 weeks. Okay. So I guess
we also have SIG VMware on Thursday. So if there's anything we want to discuss there, it's also free. It's fair game to bring up any topics there as well.
Yeah. So if there's nothing else urgent, I guess this concludes the meeting. Thanks, everyone. We'll post this video up to YouTube once we get it. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.